Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, 3 Dozen Reasons Why Identity is Key to Aligning with NIST CSF. I'm Shay Mann, and I will be your moderator today. Today's webinar is in listen-only mode, so if you have any questions throughout the event, go ahead and submit those in the Q&A panel, and we will answer them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. This session will be recorded, and we will email you a link to the recorded version tomorrow. Joining us today is John Banghart, Senior Director for Technology Risk Management at Venable. John leverages his significant federal government and private sector experience in cybersecurity to navigate issues related to risk management, government policy, standards and regulatory compliance, and incident management. He has successfully led efforts to address significant and high-profile cybersecurity issues within major government programs and institutions while facing complex legal, technical, and political circumstances. Also joining us today is Frank Berguglio, Public Sector Identity Governance Strategist here at SailPoint. Frank's a recognized thought leader in identity governance and administration and authentication and access control. Throughout his career, he's been involved in the design and implementation of identity-centric technologies and the development of identity standards. He has supported the Federal Identity, Credential, and Access Management Subcommittee as a subject matter expert and was involved in the development of the FICAM Roadmap, the Federal and DoD Public Key Infrastructure and Federated Identity Standards adopted by FICAM's e-authentication program. Well, with that, we have got a lot to cover today, so John, I will pass it over to you to get us started.
Great, thank you, Shay, and I'll also echo my thanks to everyone for joining us here today. Looks like we've got a great turnout, and we do appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend it with us. So what we're going to start off with here is a little bit of background related to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. I suspect that at least some of you have been using the framework or certainly tracking its progress over the last few years. But we want to level set on what we're looking at when we think about the framework and how it ultimately impacted our analysis of where SailPoint fits into it. So some quick history. So the NIST Cybersecurity Framework was originally initiated in 2013. It was the result of an executive order from President Obama in recognition that our critical infrastructure here in the United States was not only under attack at the time, but was likely to continue to come under increased attack as the years progressed. It was also known at the time, and we've seen examples of it since then, that our critical infrastructure sectors have a lot of cybersecurity weaknesses. So the executive order was released in order to help the government position itself in working very closely with the private sector to put together a framework that could help to level set and hopefully raise the bar in terms of how we were managing risk. Since its release, it has actually gained quite a bit of traction, not only within the federal government and critical infrastructure sectors, which was its original intent, but also across other sectors as well, particularly here in the United States, but also internationally. Part of the reason for that is that it is designed to be highly flexible. It is not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you what you should or shouldn't do, but rather provides the list, the things that you should be thinking about when it comes to managing cybersecurity risk in your organization, and breaks it down into some very sort of logical things, logical ways of thinking about and addressing the problem that we'll look at in a moment. Composed of 3 primary parts. One is called the core, which is all of the controls, what NIST calls the subcategories, related across a variety of functions and other categories. Also includes what are called implementation tiers, which we'll touch on briefly today, which can help organizations understand how well they may be meeting the particular subcategory within their own organization. And then also a notion of profiles, which again speaks to the flexibility of the framework, allows organizations to decide based on their risk and their understanding of the threats against them, what parts of the framework make sense for them. What are the profile that you can assemble that says, here's what we think we need to be doing and why, and here's where we want to get to. So let's take a look at some of the, starting with the core, which I mentioned. So the core is initially laid out in what we call 5 functions, and you can see them here: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And underneath each one of these functions, you'll find a variety of categories that, again, are meant to bring together the specific controls in a logical way, right? In a way that allows you to be able to say, we need to do asset management. What does that look like? We need to understand what our governance of cybersecurity risk looks like. We need to be able to do risk assessments. We need a strategy. And in the more recent version of the NIST framework, which was released late last year, they've added a significant amount related to supply chain risk. If you follow the news at all, regardless of what sector you're in, you know that supply chain risk, both software and hardware, has become a significant issue. And the NIST framework reflects that in terms of providing, again, guidance and ways of looking at that risk and managing it. From a protect perspective, again, you'll see very common categories here, things that are very much related to what you're managing within your own organization: identity management and access control, which we're going to focus on quite a bit today, but also awareness and training, data security, maintenance of assets, and the various protective technologies that you have in place, whether it's to help protect the perimeter, but also the defense in depth. What are you doing at the host level? What are you doing in terms of network segmentation? All of those best practices are laid out as part of the protect function. Next, we move to detect. As you might expect, we're looking at what are the anomalies on our network, how are we detecting these things, how are we monitoring them, not only at points in time, but also on a continuous basis. What do we do with the events that we actually discover? How do we manage them? How do we triage them? How do our processes ensure that not only are we looking at our events and detecting them with discipline and rigor, but that we're actually doing something meaningful with them, and how that information feeds in particular to the next function, which is respond. So respond covers things like response planning, right? It's looking at, do you have an incident response plan? Do you test that incident response plan? Do you have a process for going back and actually making changes to your incident response plan after you've had an incident? What is your process for lessons learned? This idea of continuous improvement over time so that you're always evolving to meet the what we know, of course, are constantly evolving threats. Also looks at how are you analyzing what has happened? How are you looking at this incident has occurred? Why did it occur? What's the root cause? What are the processes that may have failed, or the technology that may have failed? And then how, again, do we address that moving forward so that we reduce the likelihood of the same kind of attack or the same kind of weakness being taken advantage of? And then finally, and this one is of increasing importance as well across the industry, is this idea of recovery. Oftentimes we think of it in terms of resilience, but it specifically the NIST framework is looking at once something bad has happened, and we assume that something bad is going to happen at some point, that you're going to have some sort of an incident. It could be a breach, it could be a DDoS attack, it could be any number of things. How are you prepared to actually not just respond, but how will you come back from that? If you get hit by a ransomware attack and it takes down all or part of your network and assets, what are the processes that you have in place? What are the technologies that you have in place to actually get back to operation? And it also looks at communications, right? What is your process and strategy around public relations? How will you communicate not only internally to internal stakeholders, but also to external stakeholders, whether they be customers, regulatory bodies, and so forth. So across those 5 functions, you have a lot going on there, and it is meant to be, again, very comprehensive, but also drill down to a level where you can start to see, here's a specific action that I could take and how I might go about measuring it. So let's take a look at one of those. So let's take a look here at the protect function, and in particular, we want to look at a subcategory within that. There we go. So we have the function protect. So within that, we find a category, identity management, authentication, and access control. So now at the category level, you can see that we have a description. What does this category actually mean? So access to physical and logical assets, associated facilities is limited to authorized users, processes, and devices, and so on. So it frames what it is you're going to be looking at within this category. So we've gone from the high-level function of protect. We've gone down now to the category that's specific to identity management, authentication, and access control. And then we go down a level below that to what we call the subcategories. This is an example of one of the subcategories in the protect function. There are many, but you can see now we're getting somewhat specific. Access permissions and authorization are managed, incorporating the principles of least privilege and separation of duties. So now at the subcategory level, you have the ability to see some very specific things. In this case, principle of least privilege, separation of duty. Those are measurable things that you can go across your organization and say, are we doing these? Particularly, are we doing them in a way that is informed by risk? Have we done the homework to know where our high-value assets are? Where is our critical data? Are we doing the things that we need to do to protect it, including, again, specific examples in this case? One of the things that the NIST framework does that is, I think, incredibly helpful and has been a key contributor to its success and adoption is you'll see here these informative references. NIST did a lot of work right out of the gate to make sure that everything that went into the framework was grounded in existing standards, both domestic here in the U.S., but also internationally. So you'll see here we have ISO 27001, you have COBIT, you have the NIST SP 853, and a CIS, Critical Security Control. And it's very specific. And the idea is that when you're looking to meet PRAC4, access permissions and authorization, where do you turn for more information? Because at this point, the framework stops here. It's given you as much information as it's going to give. It's helped you to sort of frame the risk, to frame how you want to move forward. But where do you turn to get more information? And by including all these informative references, most organizations can find one that's applicable to them. Again, whether they're US-based or international. So combined, all of this information, again, gets assembled in a way that allows an organization to understand, I know what my risk is, I know the steps that I want to take, I know where I am today, and I know where I want to get to. And that's really where the profiles come in. So let's take a look at just a simple example. So here, we're doing this at the function level, but the profiles actually can exist all the way down to the subcategory level. And what you see is you've got your current. So you've identified the controls that you care about. You've identified why you care about them. And you do an assessment and you say, okay, here's where we are today. Here's what we're doing. Here's the gaps that we have between where we are, and you can see the next, as you move to the right, where do we want to be? And in this example, you can see pretty dramatic increases across all 5 functions. That won't always be the case. In many cases, you may find that you're doing well with certain functions or categories or subcategories, but are very weak in others. And those profiles are customizable. They're designed to be specific to your organization. That said, there have been efforts across different sectors to create sector-specific profiles. The energy sector has done this. The financial sector has done this. So they use the framework. They build out what they think are the most applicable subcategories in the form of a profile for their sector. And then members of that sector, whether it's banks or energy utilities, are meant to take that and further customize it, right, to further use it to build out their own specific organizational profile. These profiles can also be used to identify threats or mitigations to threats or specific kinds of capabilities. And we'll come into a little bit more on how that works here in a little bit. So now let's turn our attention to the analysis that we did specifically related to the SailPoint capabilities. So as part of our process, what we do is we take a close look at what are the capabilities that the product is actually leveraging, bringing to bear at any given organization. And we do that not just by looking at what we can find available online, which would be easy, but we work very closely with the vendor, in this case SailPoint, to figure out how is this really working. You know, let's look deeply into what is the product doing, what is it capable of, and come to some ideas and thoughts around, great, now that we understand that, what does that look like through the lens of the framework? And one of the things that we find is that in many cases, a particular product, or in this case, again, SailPoint, it's going to be very good in some areas. It's going to be sort of partial in others. And so we come up with this idea of complete, contribute, and inform. And what that means is that for each piece that we look at, for each subcategory from the NIST framework that we've decided is relevant to SailPoint, we make a determination as to just how applicable is it. So you can see complete one or more capabilities address all of the components of the NIST subcategory in the defined context. We'll show some examples of that. Contribute means that the product is actually assisting in helping to meet a particular subcategory. That means that it has a capability that is highly relevant to addressing that particular risk, but may be an incomplete picture, right? It may need to work with other products in order to finalize or to create that complete risk management picture for an organization. And then finally, inform, which means the product may be gathering information, sharing information, providing data that is meaningful, but in the context of a much broader approach. So it's informing the understanding of risk or informing the mitigation of risk without necessarily impacting it directly. We think there's a lot of value in breaking it down this way because cybersecurity risk management is complex. It does vary from one organization to the next. And when you're thinking about bringing a product or bringing a solution into your environment, it's important to understand exactly what that's going to mean to you. So having this piece of information in here, we think and have found is extremely useful for end user organizations. So the other thing that we do as part of our analysis is we take a look at what we think the capabilities are sort of bucketed into. Now, these don't come from the NIST framework. They don't come directly from the product itself, but this is our view on what is this product bringing and how do we define it in a way that is meaningful and approachable when we think about what it's designed to do. So in the case of SailPoint, we identified three categories that we thought were highly relevant. Governance being the first. Development, implementation, and enforcement of identity-related policies and provisioning actions. So what you'll see in the white paper is that among all of the subcategories that we've identified, you'll find that there are some that are grouped under governance, and you'll see why. It'll make sense because that particular subcategory is going to, again, be related to this governance definition. Similarly with access control, assign roles, manage authentication, and control access to data. So it's another useful grouping, a way of saying, hey, I see these subcategories are here. These are things I'm interested in. I understand that they're related to access control. And finally, in this case, analytics, behavioral analysis, and machine learning to see, audit, and assess user activity and risk. So again, the value of putting it into these buckets, if you will, is that we are, as an end user organization, you likely have programs that are centered around one or all of these three buckets. It helps you to think about it from an operational perspective as to, if I bring SailPoint into my organization, not only do I understand specifically which subcategories it's going to address, but I can see how these are related to my governance program. I can see how they're directly related to my access control or my analytics. And in your company, you may have different groups that are responsible for those things. And being able to break it out in this way allows you to do some internal management in terms of what groups you're going to talk about, hey, here are the subcategories that we really need to be looking to meet and why. So overall, we have do a couple of graphs that we think are also useful. Sorry about that. So the first here is to try and just give a picture of what the overall applicability is. So when you think about, again, the NIST framework in its entirety, we talked about the 5 function, the multiple categories, and we like to show sort of in an easily understandable visual way where is SailPoint coming in across those functions. Now, one of the things you might notice here is that we only have 4 functions, that we do not, in fact, have anything on the recovery side. And based on our analysis and based on of the SailPoint capabilities, we determined that there really wasn't anything substantive related to recovery. So there's nothing there for that particular function. But what this does show you is, and in particular, is where across the other 4 functions, SailPoint is particularly strong. It's got good representation across all of them, but in particular on the protect side, which is where you have a lot of your access control. It's where you have a lot of identity management type controls. So predictably, a solution like SailPoint, which focuses largely in those areas, is going to be very strong in that particular function. And our analysis definitely played that out. Additionally, we look across the buckets that we mentioned, like the categories, the governance, the analytics, and the access control. And we break it out that way. And you'll note that we've got a total of 35 subcategories that we've identified out of 98 that are in the NIST framework. About 35 were applicable in either that complete or contribute or inform. And here's how they break out in terms of the categories that we've identified. I think one of the things that's important to recognize is that you'll note, I'll go back here, subcategories are not evenly distributed across the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, right? So we've got 29 total in identify, 39 in protect, 18 in detect, and 16 in respond. So what that means is that when we're doing our analysis of a product and we're looking across what is it doing with all of those subcategories, what we find is that there is some correlation to the total number of categories that exist in a particular function. So a product like SailPoint, as I mentioned, which focuses in that identity governance space, is going to have more in protect, where in fact there are more subcategories to begin with. So you're going to find that sort of layout. What it doesn't tell is that it's not a question of the capability itself. So looking at the pie chart here, so we see 14 total controls in access control and only 10 in governance. But one of the things that's important to recognize is that in many cases, the governance subcategories, the way NIST has laid them out, tend to be broader. They tend to be more sweeping sort of requirements that may impact a much larger portion of the organization, whereas those related to access control tend to be more specific. So when we say there's 10 in governance and 14 in access control, that doesn't mean that the product in this case is much stronger or excuse me, less strong in the governance side. It just means that the way NIST has laid out the subcategories lends itself to this type of grouping or this type of analysis. So finally, let's take a look at one piece here to kind of bring it all together. So this is an example from the table that we put together in the white paper. And so you can see here the pieces that we've talked about. So starting on the left, in the left column, we have the specific category or subcategory. So IDGV3, right, which is legal and regulatory requirements regarding cybersecurity, including privacy and civil liberties, are understood and managed. That definition is taken directly from the NIST framework. It's the exact definition for that particular subcategory. We didn't make any changes to that in any way. So then moving over to the right, now you see where we have our contribute, our complete, and inform. So in this particular case, we felt that, SailPoint's capabilities were a contributor to meeting legal and regulatory requirements. You'll see what bucket we put it in. So in this case, we treated this as a governance, part of the governance category. And then finally, we put in some rationale. Sometimes it's longer or shorter based on how clear we think the coverage is. In this particular case, you can see we talk about the fact that the SailPoint governance platform contributes directly to being able to meet these requirements and report directly, but it's only related to identity and credential management pieces of it. Obviously, legal and regulatory requirements cover a much broader set of everything that an organization has to think about. But using SailPoint in that context gets you part of the picture. It contributes to that picture and works together ultimately with other tools across your organization to build you that final picture on legal and regulatory requirements. Another example, PRAC1, moving down, identities and credentials are issued, managed, verified, revoked, and audited. Complete coverage from our perspective. Given SailPoint's focus, given SailPoint's capabilities, our view was that by implementing it, you would get complete coverage across that particular part of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And obviously bucketed that under access control. Then the final example, PRAC2, physical access to assets is managed and protected. So we viewed this one as an inform, as part of access control, in part because the intent of this particular subcategory really is looking at the physical access pieces of it, guns, gates, and guards, as we sometimes say, right? How are we protecting, from a physical perspective, the assets that we have? But because of where SailPoint sits from a governance perspective and managing users, managing authorization, it informs that picture. It's not going to be the lock on the door. It's not going to be the guard at the gate. But it helps provide a picture overall, and so it's informative when you're looking at meeting that particular subcategory. So again, all pulled together here, this gives you a picture of what we've done as part of our analysis. As I mentioned, there were 35 of these. Here, this is an example of 3 of them. But the rest of the white paper contains the rest of our analysis is in exactly this same format, along with some material up front as well to kind of describe more about the methodology that we use, provide some additional examples on how we arrived at certain decisions, and to cover those pieces of it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank to kind of walk us through, now that you've understood sort of where the white paper is, you hopefully now have a better understanding of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And I'm going to turn it over to Frank to talk a little bit more specifically about SailPoint and its capabilities.
Good afternoon, everyone. Excuse me. First, we're going to take a little deeper look at some of the control areas where we might find some deeper controls and challenges that enterprises face when they're trying to meet those control areas, and then the SailPoint solution. So when we dig down in access control policy, account management, audit, identity management, we find controls that are, more designed at enforcing segregation of duties, toxic combinations of access, least privilege, access control decision-making processes, remediation procedures, auditing and review of accounts, reporting and notification. So we really can break these security controls down, as we go into the individual controls, as John showed on the previous slide. There's a lot of areas where, an identity governance and administration platform are gonna help the organization out. Some of the challenges that we see in maintaining compliance, there's just churn of employees. That could be due to contractor onboarding and offboarding, seasonal employees coming in during different periods, mergers and acquisitions. So managing that whole joiner, mover, leaver process, you can see how it's going to affect your compliance with your framework. As we move to the cloud, IT modernization, digital transformation, we're bringing in new enterprise systems, new applications, new directories, things where accounts need to be created, managed, and enforced. So that expands our problem of those SOD violations and toxic combinations of access, least privileged access and audit. As we mature, as we grow, this gets harder to manage, harder to enforce. And there's that inherent lack of centralization and visibility. We still have siloed applications and user repositories, inconsistent policies, enforcement. All these things lead to these challenges. And one of the byproducts and where, organizations fail during their audits is with entitlement creep, dormant and orphaned accounts. There's been erroneous provisioning done out of band or ad hoc. There's, again, I kind of hit on the lack of centralization and visibility of the identity. Who has access? How'd they get that access? And this overall fear, because of all this, is lack of lost productivity and efficiency, and that forces us to do things that we shouldn't. So, now we're going to kind of talk about the solution and how, the SailPoint platform really, is going to support an organization that's trying to meet these controls. At SailPoint, we believe see everything, govern everything, empower everyone. How do we do that? We're a cloud-enabled infrastructure. Whether you're deploying IGA in the cloud, whether you're looking for a cloud solution, you're managing cloud and SaaS applications, might be Office 365, Salesforce, or governing cloud platforms such as AWS. So we're addressing all of those things with our platform. We're providing a wide range of connectors and integration modules that go broad and deep into your applications, across the enterprise. So again, Azure, Workday, SAP, Oracle, tying together all of your business systems and adding these controls and automation to enforce the security control posture. Looking at unstructured data as well as structured applications. We're providing identity intelligence, AI-powered analytics to manage that risk so you can govern smarter. You can increase the efficiencies. analytics that are focused on audit, that are reviewing access over time, peer group analysis, modeling dynamic groups to identify inappropriate access or risk. We're looking at, we provide recommendations to approvers and reviewers for granting timely and efficient approvals to accurate access. Out of the box, we're making it easier to configure complex business processes to enable the automation of lifecycle events. And that might be through fulfillment and removal of access as well. We're streamlining the access certifications for audit and review. We're providing custom reporting and capabilities that can be integrated across the security intelligence that an enterprise might have. We're building a policy, a role model, a risk model for accounts, roles, specific entitlements. So we're ensuring that appropriate access is granted in accordance with your security and compliant framework. So segregation of roles, entitlements, risk-based enforcement, all these things tied together. And we're making it easy for the end user by presenting it in a business-friendly user interface, whether it's an end user or simplifying the administrative configuration of the processes for business analysts as well. So overall, the SailPoint platform's going to provide you the ability to deliver continuous governance and monitoring across your organization, and it answers the hard questions that the auditors are going to ask. Who has access? Is the access suitable? Is the access toxic? How and when was the access granted? Is the access still required? And what are the users doing with that access?
That's great, Frank. Thank you. So I'll jump back in here and talk about a little bit at a high level, but I also wanted to add something that I thought was interesting to something you just pointed out, which is auditors, right? And what are auditors going to ask about? And we have increasingly seen where auditors are actually using the framework as part of their audits. This is particularly the case where we see third-party audits. So recently was just involved with one where a large car manufacturer was auditing one of their developers, and their entire cybersecurity risk assessment was based on the framework. They used it from beginning to end to construct a series of questions, questionnaire, evidence request, and it was all based on the framework. What that means is that the value of being able to demonstrate where you are related to being compliant with the framework through SailPoint and other products is incredibly valuable, and I think will be of increasing value as the framework finds its way into more and more third-party risk assessments and third-party audits. And that leads me to sort of the first key takeaway, which is no single product can meet all subcategories. Hopefully, as I was walking you through the nature of the white paper, the approach that we took is for our analysis, and also just the framework itself, it's very comprehensive. Within those 98 subcategories, there is a lot covered there. Probably almost anything related to cybersecurity you can find somewhere within that NIST framework. That means that no one product is going to be able to say, hey, if you install this product, you're going to be 100% compliant with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It just doesn't work that way. I think we all know that, but I think it's important to remind ourselves of that, and that as you're building your risk management program, as you're looking at building your governance program, recognizing that while the framework can help you across the board, you do have work to do as you bring products in to be able to say, bringing in SailPoint, bringing in some other product is going to allow me to get part of the way there for part or maybe my entire organization. But it does take a multiple pronged approach. And that's the other key takeaway, really, is that it's not just about the products that you can bring in, but it's really about the capabilities that you can muster, the things that you can put into place across your organization that are going to help you to manage that. Again, the framework can guide you. It can give you those views into here are the things that we should be caring about for managing our own internal risk. It can give you a head start on when that third-party risk assessment comes, but you have to have the right capabilities in place and need to map them into what the framework is suggesting. And importantly, it takes me back to when we talked about profiles and having the right sort of profile for your organization. Just as you need multiple capabilities or no single product can meet all of the subcategories, it's rare that an organization needs to meet all of the subcategories. It's really based upon your risk assessment. It's based upon the threats that are against you. It's based upon what is the information or the assets that you need to protect. Being able to define that, being able to build that profile, and then taking that profile and mapping it against SailPoint and other products, that's how you ultimately arrive at that final picture, right? That this is what we're managing and here's why we're managing it. So Frank, I'll go back over to you to add anything to that.
Yeah, so I just want to follow up, those 35 ways that identity governance aligns with NIST. I encourage you to take a look at the white paper. I encourage you to, reach out to your SailPoint representatives to answer any of those questions with the framework or any of the controls. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. I think my biggest takeaway from this for everyone is the platform that SailPoint is providing, is going to allow you to achieve that continuous monitoring, continuous governance, achieve your compliance and security objectives with any framework that you're looking at. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework, calls out, as John pointed out, NIST controls, COVID controls, ISO controls. So no matter what industry you're in, the SailPoint platform is going to help you get there. And Shay, I think it's time to turn it back to you.
Thank you. Great presentation, John and Frank. We're now going to move to the Q&A portion. So if you have a question for John or Frank, go ahead and submit that in the Q&A panel, and we will answer as many as we can in the allotted time. So with that, let's jump on in with our first question. Do you see NIST alignment becoming a requirement?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So, I think that there is a back and forth that we see across the industry right now, regardless of sector. Some sectors have more regulation than others, but there's always this tension between what should be voluntary versus what should be mandatory. I think what we've seen so far as it relates to the NIST framework is certainly within the federal government it has become mandatory. Use of NIST guidance, such as 853 and the other great documents that NIST has put out over the years, has always been a requirement within the federal government. But last year, President Trump issued an executive order requiring, among other things, that all federal agencies use the NIST Cybersecurity Framework as part of managing their cybersecurity risk, and they're going to be expected and held accountable to describing their cybersecurity risk and what they're doing to manage it in the context of the framework. So I think from that perspective, it's mandatory, but that's just within that one organization, albeit a very large one. Right now, whether or not we see the framework become mandatory in other ways, I think has yet to be seen. I think it's useful. I think as it continues to find its way into more and more third-party audits, I think we may see it become the foundation for regulators such as the FTC and others. But for now, it hasn't been required in that way, but it's still a useful tool regardless. So when you look across the regulators, we'll just use the FTC as an example, they have things that they're looking for when they go and they want to look at a company. If a company has suffered a breach and the FTC shows up at your door, they're going to be looking at what controls have you implemented, what access controls have you implemented, how are you managing your risk strategically. Use of the framework guides you towards being able to answer those questions, right? Regardless of whether they're in the form of the framework or if they're coming from some other standard or some other regulator who hasn't quite adopted the framework yet, use of it still helps you in that regard. So I think we're going to continue to see adoption. It was updated. The framework was updated last year to version 1.1. NIST is committed to continue to work with industries, all industries, both domestically and internationally, to continue to update it, to keep it relevant given today's challenges. And so I think to the extent that that continues to happen, I think it's going to continue to be something that regulators and others are going to be looking for.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, our next question. We have identity primarily for single sign-on, authentication, and password. Can those identity capabilities you outlined bolt onto our existing solution, or does it require a total uproot?
Most definitely can we add the governance capabilities to your existing environment. If you're, caught up where a lot of organizations are, specifically in the federal government, where we've led with access management in public sector because of the easy, or not easy, implementation of smart card authentication, but reliance on smart cards and reliance on Active Directory. So many federal agencies got caught up in, hey, we're using Active Directory, so we're just going to provision folks there. But they have found themselves, in this quandary of, a lot of overexposed accounts because of group membership. And that's where SailPoint can come in with its analytics tools and its role mining capabilities that can bring in this access and start to look for those overexposed resources, and then put the controls in place and policies in place during provisioning to clean those things up.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, our next question. How are you able to measure the effectiveness of the framework? Can you share any examples or case studies?
Great, yeah, I can start with that one. So, measurement obviously is extremely important. It's becoming, again, increasingly important. We've touched on it multiple times when we think about, again, third-party audits, when we think about regulators, and so on. And so being able to measure it effectively is really important. One of the things that the framework doesn't do is it doesn't say what the right answer is, right? It's not prescriptive. That is, it's not going to say if you can meet this particular mark, then you are okay. If you can't meet this particular mark, then you're not okay. It really leaves it up to both individual organizations internally, but also regulatory regimes in particular sectors to say what is the minimum bar, what is the baseline that we need to be meeting. In terms of measurement, I think the framework itself lends itself quite nicely to being able to measure. Because when you think about from the let's start from the ground up. You start with a particular subcategory. You look at, are we doing this subcategory, right? Are we meeting this internally? Maybe it's related, again, to access control or something like that. You can say yes, no, or otherwise. And then that rolls up, right? That rolls up into a category and then ultimately rolls up into a function. And it allows you to paint a picture of how you're measuring yourself and where you stand based on your profile that can be communicated at a lot of different levels. It can be made meaningful for both the network defenders and the operations teams, but it can also be made meaningful to senior leadership. And in particular, I think one of the things that the framework has done a good job of, because there has been a lot of discussion around it at very high levels, what I am increasingly seeing is that even at the board level, there's a recognition that the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is a meaningful and powerful tool. And so being able to measure yourself, put it in terms of the framework, and roll that up into reports for senior leadership has been very successful because it's good at that, and it's a framework that oftentimes board members or the C-suite will actually recognize as being something that is a powerful tool for the industry. So I think it lends itself to that. I think the key to measurement, obviously, is being able to, again, decide what's important to your organization and why. You need to be able to say, we need to protect this asset or this set of data. Here's why we need to protect it, and here's the parts of the framework that we can implement that will help us protect that.
Thank you, John. Okay, another question. So how long does it take to fully implement the framework?
Yes. Well, so again, if you think about the way that we've been talking about this today and the flexibility, the idea of profiles, implementing the framework, it's not a static thing, right? It's not here's this checklist, and we're going to go and do this checklist, and once we have been able to check off all of these pieces, we're done, right? Anybody that's sort of working in cybersecurity or any sort of risk management understands that managing risk is an ongoing process. It never stops, which again is why the framework chose to not be prescriptive, because doing so would have meant it's going to become out of date very quickly. So the way to think about it isn't how long is it going to take to implement this. It's what is it that we need to do to protect our organization, how are we going to measure it, and how are we going to evolve it over time? And that is an ongoing process. So the simplest answer is it takes forever to implement the framework, right? You're never going to fully get there. What you're going to do is you're going to put a risk governance program into place based on what the framework has in it, and you're going to manage that over time continuously. You'll never actually ever be done. But you can get into place a very comprehensive risk management program and use that framework as the basis for it, again, to be able to decide what to do and how to communicate it.
Excellent. Okay, our next question, Frank, this would probably be a good one for you to answer. So with limited budget, how can we come at this with a phased approach and implement SailPoint over the course of, a couple years or whatever your time frame may look like?
Sure. Your implementation can go at your pace. First, I think the most important thing is to do that assessment. So connecting to your common systems, using our connectors and integration modules, and start looking at, potentially high-risk users, doing group analysis, looking for those orphaned accounts. So most definitely, as you start to bring in authoritative data, authoritative systems, and target systems, that's going to be a process that's going to, take some time. And you can, move forward as you're doing this. You can target role management, target policies, your access certifications. First thing you do, get clean, stay clean. So you really want to, bring this in and get your access certifications done. If you have not done access reviews accurately, starting off with those is definitely a good first phase. So there's a lot of different ways to flip your identity governance deployment to meet your needs and your budgets. It is a delicate balance, but we have a lot of partners that can help out with that, and a services organization that's eager and willing to help as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question. So as you stated earlier, no tool does it all. So what other tools have you integrated with?
So that's an interesting one. With the broad set of connectors and integration modules, like I said, integrating with your ERP systems. One of the things that we found recently in some of our customers, there's large financial audits that are occurring, and they're really getting beat up on least privilege and separation of duties. So it's tying to those systems that are causing your pain points. Privileged user administration, we have some great partners in the privileged user management community, tying in, managing those privileged users. And then once we have all this data, getting this data out into the security and analytics ecosystem that you may already have, such as, other behavior analytics platforms or business intelligence platforms and dashboards, Splunk, whatever it might be, tying in your entire security ecosystem and keeping that identity forthright and center.
Great, thank you. So we have several questions coming in about seeing a demo of the product. If you navigate to our website, you can absolutely submit a form to request a demo and get set up an instance and see exactly what you're looking for. Let's see, I think that is all the time that we have for today, so thank you for some excellent questions. As a reminder, keep an eye out for an email from us tomorrow. That will include a recording of today's webinar, and we will also be sending you the white paper that was mentioned earlier that Venable wrote on 35 ways identity aligns with the NIST framework. And again, if you'd like to learn more, contact us using the number on your screen, or as stated earlier, go to our website and ask to see a demo. John and Frank, thank you for your excellent presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined us today, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.